Welcome to you. We're journeying on with Jesus resolutely towards Jerusalem in Luke's handling of the Jesus story. Welcome to you, Anne from Whangarei, John from Auckland, and Bishop Steve from just across the harbour on the sunny side of the harbour. Nice to have you all with us once again. Tonight we've got the lost sheep and the lost coin. They're well known, and you've got a little bit of background.
Yeah, I must say it's lovely to have such a nice gospel reading. Last week, when I was kind of on unexpectedly, of course, we had that quite difficult one about hating your mother and your father. But the interesting thing is that more difficult passage finishes with Jesus saying, those who have ears to hear, hear. And this passage begins with us being told that the tax collectors and sinners are following Jesus and listening. And that's actually really significant at the beginning of this, because to listen within Luke's gospel is to be on the path towards conversion. It's the path to the kingdom of God. So really close connection between that. So on one hand, you've got this group that the religious people are convinced are sinners and outcasts. They're the ones who hear and follow and get Jesus. And then in contrast, you've got the Pharisees and the scribes who are grumbling again, as they do regularly through Luke. And their problem, as it normally is through the Gospel of Luke, is that Jesus is contaminating himself in some way or another. Here it is by associating with tax collectors and sinners. And the point is that they are so busy complaining about Jesus's inclusiveness that they can't hear the gospel, even when it's being preached right in front of him. Now, back in chapter 5, Jesus had countered those complaints by pointing out that he was a doctor and he was supposed to be where the people were sick. Here he counters those same objections with something at the heart of the whole gospel, that he's come to seek and save the lost. So it's all closely connected with some of the big themes through the whole of Luke's writings, of hearing Jesus, of including those on the edges, and the blindness of those who would set limits on God's mercy.
That's not a bad place to start. And I just want to comment that, interestingly, the NIV, which is one of the Bibles I've got open in front of me, puts the word sinners in inverted commas. I like that, because it's sinners in this story. John, let's go to you. Anne's given us a little bit of background, but where do you find some challenge when you read this?
I think there's such a lot of joy in this story, and the end result of the finding of the sheep and the coin is great joy. And I think we kind of risk being too serious at times to be joyful ourselves. That's one of the challenges. And I think another challenge is we can easily make the same mistake that the Pharisees made of wanting to appear good and treating ourselves as better than maybe we are. And in this story, are we among the seekers of the lost, or are we also those who have gone astray? I know Jeremiah talks about returning to the path that we really should be on, return to the ancient path. And whereas so often we wake up in the morning and instead of looking up to God, which might be the ancient path, we check our phones for messages and things like that.
So that's a kind of refocusing challenge. And interestingly, the joy I pick up on, because I've been listening to Rowan Williams speaking about joy this morning, and such Easter joy that he was speaking about in the context of the resurrection. We'll come back to that in a few months' time, probably. Steve, for you, where do you find some challenge here?
As someone who can frequently lose things, having just travelled back from the UK and leaving my passports in the Coral Club lounge and having them handed to me, I understand what being lost is. But looking at the types of loss that there's here and the nature of loss, and just looking a little bit further on to the next passage, we've got, what does it mean to be lost? Are we lost because of our nature? Are we silly sheep that wander off? That's the way we are. Are we lost because of what happens to us by others? A coin is inanimate, but it still gets lost. Or is it, if we look at the lost son, if you like, the prodigal son, is it our own deliberate fault? And looking at all three of them, it doesn't seem to matter. They're lost. We're not to investigate why they get lost, because they're then found. God comes, they're found, and that is the sense of what the parable's about, perhaps. Is it the joy that John just spoke about, that we are to explore and to recognize, or is it the sense of being lost and then to lament over?
I hear you there, picking up that echo of that wonderful Cranmer prayer, lost in a sense through ignorance, through weakness, through our own deliberate fault, and yet the gospel reaches us. So, Anne, the challenge for you personally.
Well, I got a kind of slightly left field challenge here, and that's looking at the fact that you've got essentially a male shepherd and a female woman sweeping out the house, and how Luke makes such a habit of that. So, you've got the Magnificat at the beginning with Mary, and then that's kind of coupled with the man singing the song Zechariah, and then you've got Simeon and Anna in the temple, and you've got the first two healings of Jesus, which were a man and then Simon's mother-in-law, and he keeps doing that. And so I guess the challenge was to follow that as a model, particularly for those of us who are preaching, but really any of the conversations we have about God. Are we always working with this one model of who God is and the one kind of set of images that we use when we're talking about God, or we're talking about God's work? And how can we expand those images to check that we really are including the whole range of people in the stories that we tell and our concept of faith and the faith life?
Well, that takes me nicely as a kind of segue to good news, because all three of you I know are proclaimers of good news. I know you well enough to know that. And yet I want to hear the personal of where the good news is for you, Steve.
I guess the words from Amazing Grace were with me all afternoon. I was thinking about it. I once was lost and now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. So I guess the good news is in that word found. I have been found. And the fact is that there is celebration. There is celebration over that which was lost. And it seems that the celebration's almost out of proportion to that which was lost. I say almost because in God's eyes, it never is. It's always in proportion and it's right. So this is the extent to which God takes hold of that which is lost and celebrates over the fact that it's come back.
There's an over the topness in a sense about the celebration here. And I love that when we encounter that in the Gospels, just overflowing with God's successive love, joy, salvation. And for you, the good news.
Well, I want to pick up what Steve mentioned as a challenge, and that was the kind of variety, the two different ways in which people can be lost and found. And one where it was their own stupid fault, really, that the sheep wandered off and got lost, and it doesn't do anything to deserve being found. It's all the shepherd going out and presumably through the night until it finds this silly little beast, and then doesn't tell it off or anything, puts it around his shoulders and carries him all the way home. So although we've got the prodigal son who kind of had to make a choice to come back to God, even then the father runs down the path to meet him. But I tend to hang on to that sheep story because when I see people I love wandering off into the wilderness, just to say it's okay, the shepherd's going to keep hunting until the shepherd finds them.
And I must confess that the lost sheep images in iconography and even in stained glass windows is often the most heartwarming. John, I just want to remind us all here that you're working amongst young people who have a remarkable shadow over the future in some way. So you've got to proclaim good news for a generation that things look a bit shaky. Some good news from you.
Well, I think these stories say that we are of intrinsic great worth. Those things which were lost in the story were of intrinsic worth. The sheep was the 1 in 100. The coin was the 1 in 10. And even if we can't see their value from such a great distance of time, the shepherd and the woman could certainly see their importance. And it's almost as though when they go missing, they become of even greater importance. Their missing seems to increase their importance. Not that I'm encouraging people to go AWOL for that, to increase our importance. But a commentator, Caird, said that to call a person lost is to say a great compliment to someone, for it means that he or she is precious in the sight of God, who will search that person out. I like that. I like that Jesus speaks confidently of what happens in heaven, because he has insight into what happens in heaven. He's been there, if you like, and joy and parting are part of the scene.
So I'm going to go back to you, John, just so you don't think there's a kind of a routine here. But again, working with young people, you above all, and your chaplain in a prep school, so what is pretty important for these young people that you're seeing growing into the future.
I'm not sure about the so what in this story. I think these are important stories, and I think kids get them. I teach the story, the parable of the lost sheep and the coin, and the kids enjoy them. They're gripped by them. The younger kids, especially when using models of catechesis, or I like those ones. The kids like them too. And the theme of lost, I mean, they've all been lost at a shopping centre. They know what it's like, maybe. They know what it's like to lose things. And to know that someone is spending time trying to find them, that's a great thing. To be wrapped around by their mother's arms again, that's a good thing. The whole parables come from, like, in chapter 14, I think the last bit is about people losing their saltiness. And even those people who have lost their saltiness and their reason for being, even those people are worth looking for. And on the eve of, well, the remembrance of what happened at the Twin Towers, even people who were misguided and chose the path of death, even those people are worth something to God. God would have tried to turn them back, I would like to think. Now, I remember the letter that Bishop Moxon put out at the time of bin Laden's death, which said we must never rejoice in the death of anyone.
Yes, indeed.
I don't know if that answers your question.
It absolutely does, John, because I read a stinging thing today about Putin, and we're all conscious of Putin at the moment. And yet my response, somewhere I heard, even a Putin, even a bin Laden, the love of God can reach. So, and the sheer extent of that love, that redeeming love that we see in these stories of the lost, is what's so what for you?
I think this are possibly the most important stories we have in the Gospels at the moment, because I think we are a culture that is lost in so many ways. I think there's a strong connection between losing your foundations and feeling lost. And so, we have so many people in our world who no longer have the foundation of a home, whether it is because they're a refugee or because they're living in a car or because they've got the uncertainty of being booted out of their rental property, or even those of us who've moved a great deal in our lives. We don't have the sort of home foundation that people might once have had. And then there's the foundation of family, which is a lot more brittle and unstable than it used to be. And that also used to cause or create a sense of home. And then there's the belonging to a faith community, and a religion was another thing that used to provide a sense of belonging and home. And all those things are really unstable now. So I feel as if this whole message of Jesus bringing us home meets a deep hunger in our world. And so I think the so what is simply, this is what Jesus does. He gathers us and he brings us home where we belong.
Indeed. And so, Bishop Steve, you're a bishop and you have this role of shepherding as well. So this must be very close to the heart. But as you look after a diocese and look after the big pictures and the small pictures, so what for you?
So what for me, I think, is how I feel when I am lost, when I have lost a child in a shopping centre, when I have lost my passport and things which were important to me. One thing that comes very quickly to mind is fear. I'm immediately fearful. And we've been talking about love. We've been seeing the outworking of God's love in the searching and the hunting. And I'm reminded that fear is driven out by love. Perfect love casts out fear. And my so what is, can I live as someone who knows that God loves them? Can I live as the person who's prepared to admit that Jesus has found me and works with me, as someone who's perhaps got a little bit of a tendency to be a control freak, who likes to know what's going on, who wants to make decisions, but is equally frightened terribly of making the wrong decisions? Where is my contentment to rest on the shoulders or in the hand of the shepherd or the woman who has found what's been lost?
So tonight we've had the joy of finding and being found, these powerful images of the extent of divine love. And thank you, Anne, thank you, Steve, thank you, John, for these are passages of joy. And I hope we can go into Sunday having a great sense of the enormous outreach of God and our part in that. Thanks for joining me and breaking open the word.